What is going on, OWS Fam, DFS Fam, YouTube Fam, Podcast Fam? Welcome to the Week 5 edition of the DFS Lab. It's our first show of the week, Draftkings edition. Keegan and I will be opening up the slate, probably taking a bit of a bird's eye view of the slate and diving into pricing, what this slate provides. Also talking a little bit about Week 4. We're recording this on Wednesday, so a good chance to still reflect back on the week behind us, what we learned from DFS, what we learned from the NFL teams, and then again, build a roster, start getting ready for this week's slate. As always, the most critical thing here is not uncovering the players, but it is talking through the slate so that we can start seeing new angles on how we can attack the slate. Some really cool stuff we're going to talk about how I attacked Week 4. And then also gives us an opportunity to talk about what DFS is really about, which is the strategy behind building rosters and how we target first place with the rosters that we are building. So with that, let's get started.
1 week season.
Keegan, my man, how are you?
Pretty good, man. That was a great intro.
Was it?
Yeah, that was
I got a lot of practice with the intros. I see we've swapped out the Adidas hat for the Titleist hat.
Indeed. Yeah, this one's it's a bit tighter. It's not as worn in,
Give it 4 years. Give it 4 years and a couple opportunities to be worn to weddings, and it'll be in great shape.
Yeah, man.
How was your Week 4?
Not profitable. But I mean, I had the correct players, just not on the correct rosters.
Did you end up playing 150? Did you attack the quarter arcade? No,
I didn't do any 150 this week. I wasn't confident in doing 150, so I just did some single entries. Actually, I did a lot less than what I'd usually do. So I probably did 4 or 5 single entries, and I was really banking on Keenan Allen this week, and it just didn't really show out for that. So
no, yeah. It was one of those, I build in such a bubble that I could have seen it, I guess, coming in retrospect if I put it in the public's mind. When I looked at ownership in the late slate and Keenan Allen was 43% or something like that in some of the contests I was in, I had him on 4% of my rosters.
Oh, really?
And that was more just I got to account for him just in case. But it was the Raiders. I talked about it throughout the week. The Raiders had done so much to sell out to stop first reads, and so I forget what coach it was, but there was a coach the other day who said, if a defense wants to take away something, they can take it away, which isn't totally true. We talked last week about even if you double cover Justin Jefferson, he really just has to beat one guy, right? If you've got inside-outside leverage, if he beats the inside guy, well, he's still open. But it's just it was going to be harder when they're limited on weapons. No Austin Eckler, no Josh Palmer. Harder for him to get open because the defense can sell out and say, you got to beat us in other ways. And I think most people just looked at it as, well, there's no other weapons, so they're just going to throw to Keenan Allen. I think that's the typical way that people look at it, but they don't necessarily see it through the lens of the defense, right? So, so you didn't end up building 150 and then shopping through those. You ended up just hand building.
Yeah, I did some hand builds this week.
All right. So I ended up finishing. It was kind of weird. I had my second place finish of the year, which it's obviously hard to have that many across 3 different weekends. It's hard to have that many 3 out of 4 weekends where you're in shape to have second place finishes, but also hard to have that many second place finishes without one of them popping into first. I did get a first place finish this last weekend in a smaller, a 500 entry contest. And then the one that I finished second in, I actually don't know how many entries it is, but several thousand single entry contest, the double spy. And I was in first place. And then Christian McCaffrey got 3 more rushing yards to put the guy tied with me in first place. And then the Patriots gave up 1 more touchdown. I had the Patriots defense on that roster.
No.
Took that dud at the Patriots defense, still scored 211 and lost a point when the Patriots defense gave up that touchdown. So finished second place there. But it was, in fact, I want to pull up this roster, and it gives me an opportunity to talk about 2 things that I think two things that are pretty critical. So this is the double spy. It was out of, I guess it doesn't say here how many entries it was. Oh, no, it does. Okay, about 1,000 entries. So this is a single entry contest, okay? And this roster had Nico Collins on it. It had who was 4.9% owned in this contest. It had Cole Kmet, who was 3% owned. It had Justin Fields, who was 7% owned in this contest. It had the Patriots defense, which obviously failed me, but was 0.6% owned. But I didn't hand build this roster, right? I didn't go. It would have been very difficult on this last week. I never heard anybody talking about Nico Collins, right? So if you're building for MME, you know Nico Collins is a player you want to account for. You know that you want to have him in your player pool, because when you're building that 150 max player pool, what you're saying is who do I have to count for? Who can put up the type of score that can win you a tournament, right? And so he's obviously in that bucket. But coming off of I think it was a 3-target, 2-catch game in week 3, you're not like breaking down the plays. And this is why I say like it's harder for people to hand build single entry sometimes, because you get in that mindset of like trying to build the optimal plays onto a roster. So you start thinking like, well, I can't fade Keenan Allen because what if he has a big game? Or I had a lot of like my hand build single entries. I forced Jamar Chase onto those. But when I'm just shopping through my 150 to find my other rosters, it's like the rosters that stand out to me. So again, I make notes on my rosters as there are certain ones that stand out. My note on this roster was one of my faves. And so after I made that note, it was like, okay, well, I want to get the double spies a $200 single entry. So it was like, okay, I think that this is one of my favorite rosters. This is one that I want to put into this contest with Nico Collins on it, right? And when I saw that Nico Collins was on the roster, it was uncomfortable because I wouldn't have hand built a roster with Nico Collins. But then you're like, well, he can win a tournament, and this roster is really good. I also had a single entry roster this week with Devon Achane, and I think Nico Collins was on that one as well. And I wouldn't have gone out of my way to hand build an Achane Nico Collins single entry roster. But when I'm shopping through my rosters, I think it was 13 total this week that stood out to me. And it was like, well, this is a really good roster. And maybe Achane misses, right? But also he can hit, and you end up getting 30 from Achane at low ownership, 38 from Nico at low ownership, 38.8. It's almost 39 from Nico at low ownership. And so again, that's like why I keep encouraging you, but also OWS Fam and anybody else listening, like even if you're playing single entry 3 max, like consider using an optimizer, because that ability to build a larger player pool, spit out 150 rosters and shop through them for the best ones, you end up with just these builds that are different, right? And I had I've had a second place in the chop block, which is like a 13 max tournament. I had a first place this last week in the chop blocks, again, 13 max tournament. I've had a second place in the slant, which is 150 max, and then this second place with single entry, right? And so it's not all like 150 max. Most of my big finishes so far this year have been these tighter builds where I'm saying, what are my favorite rosters? Let me put them in, but it's shopping through those rosters. So yeah, I'll say that first, and there's another thing I want to touch on from my play this last week, but I'll toss it over to you for any questions, thoughts, comments, whatever.
Yeah, I like the whole thing where the mindset with Nico Collins. I looked at him and I was like, he could definitely have a blow up game, but again, like you said with the hand build, it's like trying to build that optimal lineup. And I had that thought well, he didn't do good last week, and I was on him last week.
Yeah, that makes it harder.
So when you get like destroyed by a guy like that, it's like, man, do I want to take that risk again? But every game is different, so you really can't.
And Sutton's right there with 11 targets the week before, like at almost the same price. Nico was 51, Sutton was 53. And so yeah, it's an interesting, like it's just a shift, and obviously there's some people who can build single entry that way, but there's like a shift in perspective when if you're building for single entry, you're like, well, I don't want Nico Collins. But then if you're building for 150 max, you're like, well, I have to have Nico Collins in my pool, right? So then all of a sudden you've got, I don't know what I had, probably 8 to 12% Nico Collins, probably 8 to 12% Tank Dell. And so then they're getting mixed and matched across roster. Actually, a roster that I finished 45th and 49th in the slant, which is that $9 150 max tournament, 26,000 entries. I finished 45th and 49th. My 49th place one had Michael Thomas. So in that same price range. And so you're like, man, if Nico Collins had just been put onto that roster instead of Michael Thomas, then that one would have finished, I think, 3rd place in the slant this last week, right? So you just give yourself those opportunities to mix and match these pieces. But then the other thing I want to talk about here is that, and I talk about this all the time, you want to give yourself fewer things you need to get right. I guess this is a good point to like step in and say what the concept of this show is. So the concept of this show is, if you're new here, Keegan's been playing DFS for 2-3 years, playing like around his job, new kid, new marriage, work, and like trying to piece together DFS play. I've been doing DFS essentially full time for 10 years. So the concept here is for Keegan to be kind of asking questions that you guys might be asking, learning things that you guys might be learning, sharpening his play, and for me to kind of help with that process. So I always say we want to give ourselves fewer things we need to get right. So one of the things I was talking about last week very specifically is in that you can't build a roster where it's all high confidence plays. And I think we talked about this on one of our shows. You can't build a roster that's all high confidence plays that like maybe don't quite have the ceiling, because if they all hit, you're getting like 170, 180 points, right? Somebody in that contest is getting over 200 and passing you. But I think that there's also a tendency to swing too far the other way, where people say, all right, I'm going to play like this crazy play and this crazy play. And like, you have to have already, there's a lot of guesswork in whether or not a player is going to have a big game. So then if there's also guesswork in like whether or not he'll get the usage, you got to get the usage correct. Then you have to get like the big game correct, the game environment correct. And then if it's like a player with snaps, like Marvin Mims, and I had some Marvin Mims this last week. I had him on my main roster even, but like then you're guessing on snaps and usage and production, right? So you have to get all three of those things right. And then if you have like a roster full of players like that, the chances of you getting things right across all your roster spots are so low that you're gonna have like this 40-point score from some guy, but it's gonna be totally wasted, right? Or like Nico Collins, if you're guessing on Nico Collins type players who can have a blow up or a dud, you do that across your roster, you're gonna get this 39-pointer from Nico Collins, and it gets totally wasted because all your other guesses end up missing. So this last week, one of the things that I found, and I talked about it in my update on the player grid Sunday morning, actually I talked about it all week, right? That the Rams core three players, Tutu Atwell, Puka Nacua, Kyren Williams, that they'd had out of their 9 combined scores, they'd had 7 scores that you would have been really happy with. And I talked about that a lot. And I said on Friday, I said that I would probably have a rule of 1 Rams player on every roster, with a lot of rosters with 2 Rams. What I ended up realizing as I got even deeper into the weekend was there was so little certainty on the slate that it made the most sense to play all 3 guys together. And it was such an unusual build because who's going to play Tutu Atwell, Puka Nacua, Kyren Williams, and no Matthew Stafford? Like nobody's going to do that. But they cost 18.2K in salary combined. So in terms of salary multipliers, in terms of keeping you on a 4x pace, in terms of keeping you on a pace for 200 points, they needed like about 72 to 73 points. Well, they'd already had a 75 pointer and like a 78 pointer or 80 pointer so far in the season. So like 2 out of 3 games, you could have just played these 3 guys and almost treated it like one player who costs 18.2K and is probably going to get you 70 plus points. And sure enough, they ended up getting 72 points, or maybe it was 73 points again. So what I had 80% Kyren Williams, 80% Puka Nacua, 80% Tutu Atwell, which sort of forced the optimizer to have basically 2 guys on almost every roster, with like 40% of my rosters had all 3 guys on them. And all of my rosters that finished near the tops of tournaments this last week had all 3 guys on them. And obviously there's a lot here. If you're new to this type of concept, just tune into OWS because you'll pick up stuff like this. But the basic thought is like, yeah, but Tutu Atwell only put up 7 points. And it's like, yes, but nobody's playing all these players together. And so what you're doing is you're saying points are hard to get. I now don't have to guess which player is getting these points. I just know that if this game plays out the way I'm expecting it to play out, all these players get these points. And sure, Puka had it went to overtime and he got the touchdown and all that. It could have been fewer points, could have been 60 points, but that's still a great score from this huge chunk of salary. And so always looking for things like that where you can say, where can I build in certainty? What's a concentrated offense that can produce? The players are underpriced, and kind of looking for stuff like that to where now I had a block of certainty across all my rosters, right? Because I had a bunch of rosters where it was Tutu wasn't on them and it was Puka plus Kyren. So then those rosters are even in better shape, right? But then it's like, how do you build this confident block? And then you can start firing upside pieces around. So it was easier for me to go 20% Justin Fields, easier for me to go 12% Cole Kmet, easier for me to go, 8, 12%, whatever it was, Nico Collins, and kind of take these shots on players who have a lower floor, but also this high ceiling, because it's like, I know I'm getting points in this spot, and maybe I only get 60 points from the Rams, so I need these other pieces to overperform. Or maybe I get 70 plus points from the Rams, and now I'm in awesome shape, and then I also have pieces that can overperform. So yeah, just kind of like a build strategy that I just think so many people overlook. I guess fewer people watch this show than my show with Pete on Fridays, and we kind of talk conceptually about this type of stuff there. So people have picked this up, right, from listening to me, but like this kind of drills down deeper than we typically have time to into what this type of play looks like and why it's so valuable. So before we start working on our week 5 roster, let me toss it over to you for any final thoughts or questions on that type of approach.
So you basically just concentrated offenses, right? So
concentrated offenses, like the Dolphins are concentrated too, right? But the price tags are also so high that they still need a monster game. And so look at it like the Broncos, where we talked last week about how they'd only had one situation all season of a single player seeing more than 7 targets. So you can get that bet right, that the Broncos have a big game, and then you still might not get the bet correct of like any individual player having a big game. And then even if one individual player does, you don't know who that individual player will be. So there's just a lot more guesswork. Kansas City is obviously a great example. Like Mahomes is going to put up 300 yards and 3 touchdowns, and maybe none of his pass catchers are worth it at their salary. So when you can find a concentrated offense, the Vikings in past years, the Raiders last year, that eliminates a lot of guesswork and sets you forward in guaranteed points. It's not just concentrated offenses. It's also like spots where players are like, take Arizona's offense this week, right? Players are underpriced. Like Josh Dobbs has been pretty awesome. I mean, he scored like 22 plus points in 2 of his 4 games. Not pretty awesome, but pretty awesome for expectations, pretty awesome for his price tag. All of his weapons are low priced. Marquise Brown's $5K. Ertz is still in the, I think, low 3Ks. Michael Wilson's like 3,700. So like spots like that where you can say, okay, maybe this doesn't win me the tournament, but it's just like pretty solid points that you can get. But wherever you can build in, or even if it's like Christian McCaffrey, right? Where it's like, okay, I'm getting this solid base of points, and then you fire in your upside shots around that. So every week, what that week provides in this regard is going to be different. So this is the first time I've ever, that I can recall, ever played 3 guys from one team, no quarterback, and just like done that across a ton of rosters. So not every week provides exactly that, but every week is going to provide something that gives you like a higher floor and more certainty. And then you got to like find those pieces as kind of a core, and then you build in your upside around that. Or we talked last week, like my top 6 wide receivers last week, week 4, my top 6 week 3, my top 6 wide receivers were the 6 like highest scoring wide receivers on the slate. And that was like my high confidence bets was these are the top guys. And so I'm going to have a ton of these guys and then build in my upside shots around that. So every week though, you got to look for like, what are the high confidence plays? Almost like what are the plays that you want to play in single entry, you feel really good about, and then you build in your upside shots around that. But you still need those upside shots around that. Like the Nico Collins, the Cole Kmets, the Justin Fields. There were other guys this last week who hit sort of in that regard as well. But those are some good examples from this last week of those types of plays.
Yeah, and I was looking at this week's slate, and I kind of noticed like none of the tight ends that I've seen have gotten 30 points this season so far. And
or even like 20.
like 20 is their ceiling so far. I think Kelce's highest game might have been 19. I could be wrong on that. He could have like a 23-pointer, but let me see here. Yeah, 19.9 points is the highest Kelce's got this year. So I'm curious if that's just like because it's early in the season or what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, like fundamentally, Kelce still has a 30-point ceiling. But actually, let's I'm going to pull up something on, of course, when I search Travis Kelce, recommended is
Taylor Swift.
Travis Kelce, Taylor Swift. Shout out to Taylor Swift for putting eyes on Travis Kelce there. All right, so I'm going to remove your screen, and I'm going to share fantasy data where, as I mentioned before, I use this for finding like historical pricing or historical production on players. So you can sort by DraftKings scoring. And I think that people don't necessarily, I think that people like misperceive Kelce given his price tag, right? Like technically you want about 30 points from him. So this is last year. He's got this 29-pointer. He's got this 33-pointer. He's got this 38-pointer. Everything else is 24.2 and below. And you got a lot of 15, 8, 11, 11, 10, 18, 10. And then we go back to 2021 and sort of the same thing. Obviously Tyreek Hill was there, which took away some targets from Kelce, but also opened up the offense more, which, allowed him to be more open. So you start the season 25, 26.9, and then everything else right below that, saying that 24.2 mark. A lot of scores in the teens, this 5.7, and then this 44-pointer. So it's like the blow up games from Kelce are less frequent than people seem to think. You know what I mean? Like, he's typically going to get you like 15 to 20, 21, 22 points. Now there's also an element here of tight end is so interesting because it's, and this is some like conceptual, like I've said before, the DFS isn't like dots on a line, right? It's almost like you have to be able to hold all these pieces and like just see the whole picture. So there is if Travis Kelce scores 20 and nobody else, no other tight end score more than like 8, he's still really valuable just because of like, you're now 12 points ahead of everybody else at the tight end position. So even though you overpaid for those points, then, he still has value. The other elements to think about there is like, if you're paying $7,600 for him, what does that take away from the rest of your roster? Now people can overthink that. We've talked about this on hand builds. You can really be like, okay, I think a couple weeks ago, we were like, you can be on like this 4,600 player and be like, yeah, but I can also save an extra 600 here to go down to this guy. And I can do that at this position, right? And that's why the hand builds, they don't end up with Nico Collins, because you're on Nico Collins and you're like, yeah, but I can get down to Josh Palmer, save 1,100. And then that frees up 1,100 to go from this, 6,700 guy go up from Devin Achane up to Josh Jacobs, so it's like people can they can assume that the pricing is exactly right. But at the same time, so like you can pay Kelce and then that forces you to some 5K wide receivers who hit. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like that does restrict your salary. So you have to think about that as well. If there's like, if it's a week where you end up needing Christian McCaffrey or you end up needing Justin Jefferson or whoever it might be, like you might not be able to get up to them because now you have Travis Kelce. So, and then kind of the final piece there is like, it's so hard to guess on who the cheap tight end is, who will hit. But if any of them hit, you're now at a disadvantage, right? Even if the guy who hits is like 4% owned, if he goes for 20 and Kelce goes for 20, like there are rosters with that other guy and they now have 4,000 extra in salary than you have. So yeah, like Kelce's such an interesting flashpoint every week, but we also have to keep in mind, there were those you saw on the game logs, the 38-pointer last year. I think it was a 33-pointer, the 44-pointer the year before. He's going to have games like that as well. I guess we should follow the Taylor Swift trail and see if she's going to the game in Minneapolis. Because if so, like eventually they're going to get Kelce a monster game here. But yeah, tight end is, it's especially thin this week. Dallas Goedert had, I think it was a 27-pointer last year, but he's typically, he's actually started slow this year. He's almost always in like that 9 to 14 point range if you go through his game logs. Yeah, Tyler Higbee's typically going to get to like 8 to 12, sometimes 13, 14 points, although Cooper Kupp is expected back this week. So, then you've got Puka and Kupp kind of taking away targets. And then, there's always like there's the argument that like Zach Ertz has dusty legs. And by the way, I said it a couple weeks ago that Adam Thielen had dusty legs. Now I was watching the tape from that game yesterday. I was like, dude, Thielen looks fresh. Like he looks Zach Ertz, you can be like, well, he doesn't have upside because he doesn't get yards, right? And he gets all these targets, 10 targets week 1 and 8.1 DraftKings points. 8 targets week 2, 11.6 DraftKings points, 10 targets last week, 11.3 DraftKings points. But he also dropped a touchdown with like 12 seconds left this last week. So all of a sudden he scores that touchdown. That's an extra catch. That's an extra, I think it was like 10 yards. That's an extra touchdown. And all of a sudden he's got 19 points, and his price goes up. And so it's like, it's easy to look at Ertz and be like, well, Ertz is just the safe play at 3,500. But he can't get the ceiling play, but he actually can get the ceiling game as well, because not like a 30-pointer, 40-pointer, but like if Kelce scores 20 and Ertz catches that touchdown pass this week, and he scores 20, all of a sudden you save 4K and you just have so much more salary flexibility. So yeah, tight end is ugly. And right now my list is kind of broad just because it's so ugly, but it's like, there's a few pieces that are kind of just better than the others.
Yeah. With me saying that, like, nobody scored 30 points, I'm also not saying that, like, nobody can.
Right.
I have, like, a list, like, of who can. I think Hockenson could if
Yeah.
they did well.
Yeah.
Mark Andrews obviously can. I don't know if Sam Laporta can. He probably could. I mean, he's already got 22. How many touchdowns? That was with one touchdown. So
Yeah.
more
And that was
yards.
also, he had a most of his work comes really close to the line of scrimmage, and then he had like one big downfield catch. It was at a 45-yarder on, I think it was kind of a busted play. I don't recall, but at the same time, it's one thing to look at the data. It's one thing to look at the numbers. Like TJ Hawkinson's average depth of target is really low. I think it's under 5 yards downfield. Whereas like Gronk is going to be like Kelce's going to be 8 to 9 yards downfield. Hunter Henry is about 9 yards downfield. So you like those types of plays more. There was a play this last week though, where Hockenson caught the ball like at or behind the line of scrimmage, but it was a play design, like the whole play flowed out to the right and then Hockenson bled out to the left. And the play was like designed to pull the whole defense over to one side of the field. And Hockenson had it wasn't like a screen, but it was set up for Hockenson to have blockers in front of him with very few guys in front of him. So it's like that lowers his average depth of target on paper on the numbers that everyone's looking at, but it's a play designed to get him 15 to 20 yards, So on the one hand, we can be like, yeah, but he doesn't see targets downfield. He really can't hit for a big game, but they do still try to position him to hit for big games. And that Kansas City defense is pretty lights out against wide receivers. So I think Hockenson is overpriced, but actually pretty interesting this week. It's hard to go double tight end because, as we were saying, really the main key of a Kelce isn't that he's likeliest to get you 30 plus points so much as it's the positional advantage, right? He gets you 25 and all the other tight ends get you 12 or fewer. Now you're at an edge. So it's kind of weird to play Kelce Hockenson together because you lose that positional advantage. Now you're putting one of these guys in the flex. At the same time, it's also kind of weird because Mahomes is the quarterback to play in that game. Kelce's the clear stacking partner, but then Hawkinson's probably the best bring back, So you could almost build a super unique Mahomes, Hockenson, no Mahomes stacking partner roster where you say like, Mahomes does what he's done so far this year, where he's putting up, I don't think he's put up like a 33 pointer or 35 pointer yet, but like you say Mahomes puts up 33 points and so he's, kind of topped off at like 25 points so far this year. Well, let's say he puts up a 33 pointer, but Kelce only puts up 20. And then all the receivers, it's like spread out to where maybe a couple of them are good salary multipliers. But remember, like, we can't box ourselves into salary multiplier. Nico Collins went for almost an 8x this last week. So like you want ceiling, you want the guys who can pop for big games. So like Rashee Rice goes for 14 points at his price tag. You're like, oh, that's pretty nice, but it's still probably not winning you a tournament. Right. So, and then on the flip side, like Mahomes is putting up 33 points. That means Kansas City scoring points. It means the Vikings are being forced to throw, try to keep up. And maybe Hockenson is the guy who gets all the points because they're isolating Justin Jefferson, taking him somewhat out of the game. And there's some interesting ways to approach that game where you could literally play Mahomes naked with TJ Hockenson as the bring back and just have a unique type of setup there. It's actually kind of like tight end is such a low confidence position in general, and then it's even more low confidence than normal this week. So it's a funny place to start the conversation, but it's actually a really interesting place too, because it opens up kind of thoughts like this of how could we attack this position? What could we do this week to sort of gain an edge at the tight end spot? And how that trickles out to the rest of our roster.
Okay, yeah. So is that what you're wanting to start this?
Yeah, we could do it. We could go Hockenson and Patrick Mahomes and just say, let's see what happens with this type of build.
Okay. In my opinion, this is a very low confidence build for me, but maybe.
Yeah, but what's funny is it's low confidence because it's unique, and yet, do you feel confident that Mahomes puts up a big game against Minnesota? And do you feel confident that like Hockenson has a shot at putting up the top tight end score? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Yes and yes. And so just because it looks so weird, people don't want to build like this. And if we put this in the description of the video, people will be like, what are they doing? But like, it actually, you break it down, it actually makes sense in terms of, now, one thing I would want to think about is for Mahomes to really get to like 33 points or 38 points and win you a tournament, there's still probably one pass catcher he's bringing with him. So in that regard, I'm actually going to check real quickly snaps last week for these guys. But in that regard, we would want to pick one of these Kansas City pass catchers and say, where you're down at like cheap enough price tags. Okay, so Rashee Rice has gotten up to 32 snaps last week. They had 70 total snaps as a team, so just under 50%. But in terms of like who the alpha is, Justin Watson's out there, but primarily as like a blocker. Sky Moore is out there 41 snaps, but he's kind of in this gadget role. Where are we at on Kadarius Toney? Kadarius Toney 17 snaps last week. So Rashee Rice, he continues to see ascending snap counts, and you can look at his targets and see that he's seeing, at 39 snaps a week before. So he's going to be in this like 30 to 40 snap range, consistently seeing kind of like 3 to 5 targets, 1 week with 7 targets. So yeah, I think that he's probably the most interesting stacking partner, primarily because he's the most complete receiver, in that like Sky Moore and Kadarius Toney are pretty confined to these short area gadget type stuff. And almost all their targets this year have been first read targets where the play was designed to go to them in the short areas, or have been scramble drills. Whereas Rashee Rice is able to get some schemed usage down the field. So we do want to think about like if Mahomes actually puts up 35, which we're now saying on this roster that he will, because we're rostering him, he probably brings somebody with him. And so Rashee Rice would be an interesting way to go, and also kind of frees up salary after we've started with this expensive starting point. Yeah,
and it does get really tricky because obviously he's probably going to give Kelce, 1 touchdown if he's getting 30 points. Not hopefully, but probably, like outcome wise, that's the likeliest outcomes. At least Kelce gets like one of the 3 or 4 touchdowns that are in that game. Yeah.
Although if, let's say Mahomes rushes for 1, throws for 3, Kelce gets 1 and he catches 6 for 70 and a touchdown, right? That's 19 points at 7,600. So then we can also think about like, who are the Kelce rosters not being like the Mahomes plus Kelce rosters might not be able to roster, somebody else who's the same price tag at a different position. So we can kind of think like that as well of like,
oh man,
for Kelce,
that I feel like they wouldn't be able to roster Justin Jefferson.
I feel like we wouldn't either.
Probably not. That this is
getting... and if once I put Justin Jefferson on, then I want like probably 2 partners with Mahomes if we're going Jefferson and Hockenson.
So we're saying it's just going to be some crazy blowout game.
In this scenario?
Yeah.
No. In this scenario, we're just saying Justin Jefferson's so expensive, right?
Yeah.
This can be 34 to 31. And Kelce only accounts for 1 touchdown, but doesn't have a ton of yards. Jefferson, puts up 20 points, but that's way less than you need at his salary. You're going to get 20 points from a lot of other players. And so, then you're just saying like Hockenson puts up a 30+ point game, which he can do. We've seen him do it in this offense. Rashee Rice puts up 17 to 20 points, whatever it might be. And it's a high scoring game, but neither offense is super concentrated. The Vikings have 5 guys, really 6 guys now, with Cam Akers starting to mix in with Alexander Madison. So they're not super concentrated. And then the Kansas City has, like 8-9 guys that they're going to spread the ball around to. So you can have a lower scoring team. And speaking of guys that the Kelce rosters wouldn't be able to fit, I would say, if we're going to go up in price, Tyreek Hill would be the guy, because it's like, then it doesn't break our thesis of this roster. And I don't know what this would do to our salary, right? Like if it would actually be viable, but people are going to, so it's pretty interesting to think about it, just because, and again, just from a strategy perspective, what would our competition not be able to do if they're playing Mahomes? They're probably doing Kelce instead of Hockenson in this flex. And then they're trying to see if it's possible to fit in Justin Jefferson. So Mahomes, Hockenson, Tyreek Hill, like we could say it like this. Let's say Mahomes is 12% owned this week. What percentage of those rosters also have Tyreek Hill? Like probably under 10% of the Mahomes rosters have Tyreek Hill, maybe even less than that, right? So now you're sitting at like 1% or less of the tournament field has Mahomes and Hill. So now what happens if Mahomes is the quarterback you had to have, but Hill is the wide receiver you had to have, this is a high confidence story that we're telling. Mahomes puts up 35, Hill puts up 40 something points. And all of a sudden, it's like you're one of the only rosters with both guys on it. Now, obviously, this restricts us a lot, but it's an interesting way to kind of start this roster and think about things.
Yeah, so I think the cheapest defense like I was on so far was the Jets. Unless, I mean, I don't mind the Titans.
Yeah, I like the Titans, and I even like, we know how good the Vikings offense is, right? The Vikings scored 1 touchdown on offense last week. Did they win that game 14-13, or they won it? No, they won it by a touchdown. They won it 21-13. So they scored 2 touchdowns on offense. One of their touchdowns was a defensive touchdown. So like this Panthers defense is really good. I would prefer Tennessee just because Tennessee is so game plan specific, and Anthony Richardson is such a handful on the ground, but Tennessee's run defense is so good, and Richardson's going to make some mistakes. But either one of those are like viable. There's better defenses, obviously, but either one of those are viable this week. Let's throw in Tennessee because that just lets us see if this type of roster is possible.
Cool. So I mean, it's getting pretty thin on the running back area, but
yeah. Okay, so look up Wan'Dale Robinson, and Robinson's going to be popular this week. But
I feel like I played him last year. I definitely did, like a lot. Whenever he was injured, Saquon was injured. I think I played him. He's 3,000. Sweet. 9 points, 6 points. I mean, that's 3 times his salary, right? So. JM. You there? Well, is it me that's frozen now? Nope. JM's gone again. That sucks. Give me 1 second. Let me see if he can get back in.
This is just getting ridiculous.
There we go. Sweet.
That's my Ethernet connection. I don't know why this keeps happening, but I guess I'm just doing Wi-Fi from now on. That's back-to-back shows. Okay, apologies for that, you guys. Yeah, Wan'Dale Robinson, like he's gonna be popular this week. And the question on somebody who's gonna be popular is like, well, like we said, right? Like I think a lot of people last week were going down to Josh Palmer, right? And they're just like, well, he's only 4K. And I started thinking, and Palmer was a really good play. I had a decent chunk of Josh Palmer, but you can spend 1K more and get up to the Nico Collinses who can go for 30, right? And Josh Palmer was kind of capped at last year. He never topped like 15, 16 points. Well, he had like a 33 pointer, but Keenan Allen and Mike Williams were out. So when Keenan or Williams were playing, he was kind of capped in like the 15, 16 point range. And that was like his likeliest ceiling. So you don't want to just play the popular cheap guy if he's going to get you like 8 points, right? Where you're like, yeah, it's a good salary multiplier, but now that's one guy on your roster who can't help win you the tournament. But again, looking at past production, Wan'Dale Robinson last year, 22 pointer this last game of the season, 9 catches for 100 yards on 13 targets, didn't even score a touchdown in that game and put up 22.4 DraftKings points. Also had this 12.7 pointer with a touchdown, also had this 11 pointer without a touchdown. The Giants drafted him very specifically to be like, I'll say it like this. He was one of the first players that Brian Daboll drafted last year. Brian Daboll was the new coach of the Giants last year. Wan'Dale Robinson was their second round pick, and he had a very specific vision for how Wan'Dale Robinson would fit into this offense. He talked about it a lot last offseason about how crucial Wan'Dale Robinson was to this offense. And then Wan'Dale Robinson got hurt, missed most of the season. So now he's back and his snaps should be ramping up. I haven't even checked his snap share from last week yet, but yeah, basically like he's out there. I think the week before he had only like 11 snaps, but 5 targets, right? So that tells us that when he's out there, they're trying to make sure they get him the ball. Last week, he ramped up to 48 snaps out of 75 for the Giants. So we would expect that this next week, he'll be up in that like 50 to 60 snap range. Typically, a team's going to run about 60, 65 snaps. So you're talking about like he's kind of the number one receiver. And Isaiah Hodgins was a practice squad player last year and then got called up. Darius Slayton was buried on the Giants depth chart, and eventually they had to force him into action. Paris Campbell has been cast off by the Colts. And then you've got Wan'Dale Robinson, who's a second-year player, second-round pick last year, a guy they handpicked, a guy they want to build around. So, I mean, you don't want to take the 3K guy who you're just like, well, he's going to get me 6 or 7 points. But, like, Wan'Dale Robinson can get you 15. He can get you 18. He can get you 20. And, you know, that's hard to get at any price point, right? Justin Jefferson might get 20 this week, and Wan'Dale Robinson gets 20 at 3K. So I think he's a super sharp play. He's be popular, but he's not one of those guys I'll like avoid because he's popular.
So I accidentally said, I think maybe like when you were lagging out that I was wondering who he was. And I messed up and I said that they put him, they used him a lot whenever, I think I accidentally said Saquon was out. But who was out last year, wide receiver wise, whenever they started like using him a lot more? Because I know somebody had gotten injured, and like that was the week.
Oh, could have been Sterling Shepard.
Yeah, that's
Sterling Shepard. But I mean, again, Wan'Dale Robinson was kind of, and Shepard Shepard was a really good wide receiver, but you know, had an Achilles tear a couple of years ago, and most players are never the same after that. Like their wide receiver room is probably the worst in the league. And then you got Wan'Dale Robinson, who is a pretty electric talent. He's a Zay Flowers type of player, as in he's the kind of guy you want to scheme him touches close to the line of scrimmage just to get the ball in his hands. But then also unlike Rondell Moore in Arizona, where it's like you scheme him touches and that's all you can do, or Kadarius Toney, you scheme him touches and that's all you can do. They can also kind of put him in schemed routes and run him downfield, and he can be a downfield receiver like Zay Flowers has shown this year. So, yeah, there's Calvin Austin chalk where it's like there's not a lot of value, but Calvin Austin's here. And it was like Calvin Austin wasn't a bad play last week, but he wasn't a good play, and a lot of people were going to be on him. Whereas Wan'Dale Robinson's actually good. If he were 4,200, he'd be a pretty solid play this week. So at 3K, he's not chalk I mind eating. And again, nobody's going to have this core thesis of ours, right? Where it's like Mahomes, Hockenson, Rashee Rice, Tyreek Hill. And again, it's very viable to paint a story in which Mahomes is the quarterback you had to have this week, and Tyreek Hill is the wide receiver you had to have, and most people won't have them together. So we have a very low-owned, our highest ceiling pieces are low-owned combinatorially, and that just helps us so much in terms of getting to first place, that Wan'Dale Robinson could be 40%, which he won't be, but he could be 40% owned, and we really wouldn't mind it because it opens up this unique build for us.
So could we also take another piece from the Chiefs running back wise with us, saying that he's going to maybe throw a touchdown to one of these running backs? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, Jerick McKinnon has kind of traditionally been one of the better stacking partners with him. Isaiah Pacheco caught a touchdown last week. I believe he caught a touchdown last week. Not typically used in the passing game. Did he not catch a touchdown? No, but he did catch a long pass at the sideline. Not typically like a super high pass game role. I will say last week's 27-pointer from Pacheco, it was like the first time in, I think, like 5 years, first time since Clyde Edwards-Hilaire's first game of his career that we've had a Kansas City ground running back top 20 points. So it's pretty rare just because they throw so much close to the goal line that those guys don't typically get the touchdowns. But yeah, Jerick McKinnon's always kind of a guy you can consider in this backfield. At the same time, there are running backs in this, like, who are just a little bit more than him, who maybe have higher ceilings as well. You know, DeAndre Swift is 6K, Devon Achane is 6,100, Mostert 6,200, Jahmyr Gibbs is 5,900. And it's like watching that Panthers defense, it's so hard to pass against them. And then they're just beg teams to run against them. Like their defensive line gets shoved back on every running play. And not only that, most teams you see, like, play action is so effective because the quarterback goes for the handoff motion and the linebackers like move forward. Linebackers' responsibility is forward first and then back second, right? So if it's play action, linebackers start flying forward. The Panthers, I don't know if it's how they're coached or just how their linebackers are, but on running plays, they're kind of flat-footed and they don't move forward. So play action isn't as effective against them, but run plays are so effective against them. So expect the Lions to run a lot this week, which obviously means David Montgomery. But, what if the Lions are like, hey, let's give Jahmyr Gibbs the touches? And again, this is the type of roster where we could put Jahmyr Gibbs because Mahomes, we know that the offense flows through him. Tyreek Hill, we know that the offense flows through him. Wan'Dale Robinson, we know he's sharp value. TJ Hockenson, we know that's like somewhat high confidence in terms of usage if this game blows up. So not to say that we have to go with a player like Gibbs, but just saying this is the type of roster where you could put a Jahmyr Gibbs. And then you've also got James Conner, who's 5,800. He's put up 20 points 3 times this year, 19 points 3 times this year in this underrated Cardinals offense. And I mean, Joe Burrow, and it could move, it could change after another week of rehab, but like the dude can't move. And it's one thing to like watch. I've said this before, like when you watch all the games, certain things really stand out because you see you're just feeding your brain all this other information. And if you just watch a Bengals game, it doesn't stand out to you that Burrow can't move. But if you like watch it after watching Brock Purdy, like sliding and moving around the pocket, you're like, bro, like here comes a pass rush. Purdy avoids it. He moves up. Baker Mayfield avoids it. He slides up. He moves outside. Like he rolls out. He ducks around a guy, like slides out to the left. Like Burrow's just standing there. And this Cardinals defense is really smart. They're not super talented, but they're really smart. And so I could see kind of Arizona controlling this game or at least staying right in it enough that Connor can have a solid game. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places that we can go at running back. I don't think we have to go to one of these guys.
What about Breece Hall? What are your opinions on Breece Hall this week?
Yeah. So did you see the report this morning that they're saying restrictions are off? I don't know what that means, right? Because let me say it like this. Zach Wilson had like a top 8 quarterback performance this last weekend. Like he looked legitimately awesome.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just this last game. His last drive, his final drive the previous week, or like one of his last drives the previous week, Tony Romo said on the broadcast it was the best drive of Zach Wilson's career. And that was week 3. Like Zach Wilson has started rounding into form and now he's playing the Broncos. I don't know what that means in that you got Nathaniel Hackett with the revenge game against the Broncos. You got Zach Wilson looking good, but also the Jets want to win, right? So it could be like 25 pass attempts for Zach Wilson, and he just looks awesome, but they don't need him. And then they run it with Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook. I think that's the likeliest way for this to play out. I still think that Dalvin Cook is going to get 40% of the carries. So you need, I was thinking about this yesterday, like you probably need a 30 carry game from the Jets backfield as a whole. And then Breece Hall can end up getting like 17 of those carries. So, but yeah, I do think that there's potential in this game environment where the Jets defense is so good that they're Kansas City scored 17 points in the first quarter against the Jets. And then after that, they couldn't score the rest of the game. They scored 6 more points. The rest of the game, that's Kansas City Chiefs, right? Like, so I could see Denver struggling here, the Jets having good time in possession, and Breece Hall getting like 16, 17 carries. So yeah, he's one of the guys on my list this week. In fact, I've got a list of, let me find this list. So I've got a list of running backs who can put up the top score on the slate. He's not on that list. And then I've got like the list of just running backs that I like based on like price and the ways roster construction will work this week. And let's see, guys on that list are like Bijan Robinson, the 2 Lions, Derrick Henry, the 2 Dolphins, Joe Mixon, who I never play, but he is in a good spot this week, James Conner, DeAndre Swift, and Breece Hall. So it's like, he's in that mix for me this week.
Sweet. I'm going to put him in there. And then just like a quick side question. Since we're talking about like the Jets and Zach Wilson, do you think Zach Wilson had his Trevor Lawrence moment that you talked about?
What I said on Twitter 2 weeks ago, I said, before we realized how bad the Broncos defense was, I said that I was pretty convinced that Zach Wilson was not the same old Zach Wilson. And I said it just didn't look like there were going to be like a good opportunity for him to show that because of this string of like tough defenses he was coming up against. He was coming up against the Patriots and then Kansas City and then the Broncos. And then there's 2 other tough ones after this. And so my thought was like, Zach Wilson's not, I said in the tweet, like, I don't think Zach Wilson will be able to show this until coming out of the bye against the Giants, which is like week 9 or something. But some people asked, like, what are you seeing with him that leads you saying that? And I didn't get a chance to answer, but it was basically like Salah has talked about this a lot. Like, Zach Wilson has no problem making the reads. Zach Wilson is excellent at quickly making reads and understanding what the defense is giving him. What he hasn't been good at is quickly reacting to that and pulling the trigger on it. So in other words, what he hasn't been good at is the confidence to trust himself. And just the way like that he has been talking and presenting himself, like that simple thing has been like, oh, this dude has his confidence back. Like, he actually believes in himself right now. And then, you put him out there against whatever it's been, the Buffalo and Dallas and New England and Kansas City. And it's hard to show that, but he started showing that at the end against New England. He showed it against Kansas City, and those are top 8 defenses. And so then all of a sudden he's got the Broncos, right? So yeah, I think that the confidence has already been growing. It's probably a thing of, having, nobody is as into like the mental side of things as Aaron Rodgers is. And some people would say like too far overboard on it, but it works for him. Right. And I think that just being around somebody like that, who has that enormous amount of self-confidence, and Rodgers wasn't known for helping Jordan Love behind the scenes, but now Rodgers like knows that this is the end. This is the last chapter for him. So also he's like very willing to go out of his way and help Zach Wilson. Zach Wilson calls Aaron Rodgers his big brother. And so like Zach Wilson is, to me, he is, early in his career, man, Tony Romo, who knows as much about quarterback as anyone, was like raving about Zach Wilson's tools and how great Zach Wilson was going to be. And then he just like, Wilson just lost it, but yeah, I do think that he already kind of had those steps, and then that play is just going to make it easier for him to have that confidence. Like, I've played around with the idea of playing 100% Garrett Wilson this week, because like, even if they throw it 25 times, Garrett Wilson's going to get 10 targets probably against this Broncos defense. And Zach Wilson looks really good. I probably won't go 100%, and it's early in the week, but like, I'll probably have a lot of Garrett Wilson this week, and I'll definitely have some Zach Wilson, because he genuinely looks like an exciting young NFL quarterback. And this matchup, was Justin Fields was like 21 of 21 at one point last week, like 200 something yards and 3 touchdowns. Like, this is not a tough defense. They're going to obviously keep working to get better, but right now this is just a good spot for this Jets offense. I just don't know how that will show itself, right? In terms of, are they going to just take the lead and then run the ball, which wouldn't surprise me. They don't care about stats. There's the outside chance that Hackett does care about it after the way things went with Denver last year, but realistically, they care about getting the win, and that might mean just a lot more Breece Hall running the ball.
So if we want to throw Garrett Wilson on this roster right here.
Yeah, I had that thought when I saw that salary would work for that. I think it's kind of a tough, maybe it's not, right? Maybe it's not such a tough call to do it. Neither of them has produced a score all season that matches up with their price tag. And then you're going to say, like, now they're both going to do it in the same game, which is kind of a stretch. At the same time, the context of it is valuable. They played the Cowboys. They played the Bills. They played the Cowboys. They played the Patriots. They played the Chiefs. And so could it happen here? Yeah, like you talk about them as an 11.4K player. Can they score 45 combined points? Honestly, it's not that hard for them to do. Yeah, I kind of like it. I don't think I mind it, because if Breece Hall gets 18 touches, he can go for 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. And if Garrett Wilson is, the other wide receivers on this team are Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, so Garrett Wilson, he can put up 100 yards and a touchdown without Zach Wilson being a worthwhile play, right? Because Zach Wilson might put up 225 and that 1 touchdown pass. So yeah, it's unique, but I think it's viable here. It's not one of those solid blocks like the Rams were last week, where you're like, and then you're just getting these points, but I think it works on this roster.
Sweet. I think we should, with all the risk we have been taking on this roster specifically, maybe we should like go down a little bit and get James Conner over Jahmyr Gibbs.
Yeah, I like that. Because and the thing is, it's not like Connor can't get 30 points. He gets enough touches that he can. Bengals run defense hasn't looked good so far this year. And Jahmyr Gibbs could get you 30, but he could get you 6. Whereas Connor, obviously he could get you like 12 or 13, but his likeliest range is going to be in that like 15 to 22 point range. And every once in a while, he'll have like a 26, 28 pointer in there. And so, yeah, I like that idea. You kind of take that extra safety on there. And this is, and I've had a few rosters this week where I kind of look at it and I've like a few practice builds and I'm like, wait a second, how did I fit in so many high-priced guys? Like I've had some rosters with, I probably won't play a lot of Jamar Chase this week, but I've had rosters like Derrick Henry, Jamar Chase, and Justin Jefferson. And I'm like, wait, how is that possible? Then you realize, well, I've got Wan'Dale Robinson, or I've got like Josh Dobbs and Michael Wilson, Zach Ertz, and you're like, oh, it does free up some salary to where I'm not going out of my way to fit in all these high-priced guys, but there are ways to do it. Like Mahomes, Hockenson, Tyreek Hill should really restrict your salary, but this doesn't feel like a roster where we were then like, oh, we got to take all the savings,
Yeah.
And part of that is, the running back position this week, like go to the top of the running back list. Like Bijan Robinson is probably getting about 20 touches, and like that's a lot to pay for a guy who's going to get 20 touches. Derrick Henry's a great play this week. Like he's got a good shot at one of his 25 to 30 point games. But, Saquon Barkley has that. Actually pull up Saquon's game log. And we see that first game, which was 27 point, or second game, 27.2. Do you know that's his best game in Brian Daboll's offense? This is best game, right? Everybody's going to pay like comfortable paying 8,100 for a guy who hasn't topped 27.2 points in this offense. And not to say he can't, but it's like that he's pretty overpriced, right? Bijan Robinson, he can get you 30, but can he get you 40? Can he bury you for not playing him? He's pretty overpriced. And so you kind of go down the list, and then David Montgomery, obviously he can get the touchdowns, but he could also get you no touchdown to get you 12, 13 points because he doesn't catch passes. So it's like you're kind of compelled to be down in this lower range of running back, which frees up salary to go other places. Again, I like Derrick Henry this week, and it's Wednesday. There's time for things to develop. But and then with the savings in some other places, or Garrett Wilson being underpriced for his ceiling, and Wan'Dale Robinson being underpriced just fundamentally, there's just a lot that we can do this week. And it makes it a week that I really like, because I think that weeks like this, they tend to be pretty clear to me, and other people tend to have issues with them. So that's a double bonus right there.
Sweet. I like our lineup.
Yeah. It's a pretty nice, I've kind of felt that way with all my practice builds so far, where I'm like, oh, I really like this, which kind of just means I like the week, Any final thoughts before we hop out of here? It get dark in your recording room.
Yeah, I know. My window, usually I just use the natural light, but it like just rained, and I think it's still raining, so it's just really dark. And
you didn't even like close the blinds or anything?
No.
That's wild.
Yeah.
I use the natural light, and then like a lamp on my desk, because I'm in Oregon, where the natural light is gone this time of year. So, all right. Well, anything else before we hop out of here?
Nothing.
Cool. Appreciate the time. Appreciate you guys for hanging out with us, watching, listening. And again, use this kind of time of the week not to make final decisions, but just to let me talk about that real quickly. So basically, I treat each week almost like game day. Like all of this is practice. And I'm going to have like Shane Steichen was talking about this, something I was watching yesterday. Shane Steichen, Colts head coach, former Eagles offensive coordinator. He was basically saying, like, once you're in the game, you're play calling, it's all about the flow of the game. And you just have to feel it, and you have to make calls, and you've got your whole sheet, you've done all your prep, and you're like, here's all my 2nd and 7 calls, and here's all my 3rd and 1 calls and all that. But then like you're in that moment, sometimes like, you know what? I'm moving off of my 3rd and 1 calls because I really like this play in this situation. And for me, that's what Saturday night is like for building. All of this is preparation. All of this is laying the groundwork. Sometimes 90% of what I think of throughout the week is exactly what I'm going to roll with on Saturday night. And sometimes I start seeing things differently on Saturday night. So always have build a process for yourself where you're not making firm decisions early in the week. You give yourself that opportunity to make final decisions late in the week, but this is a good opportunity to get a sense of what some of our late decisions might look like, start playing around with the slate, preparing ourselves to make sharp decisions at the end of the week. So with that, we will get out of here. Thanks for hanging out. We will see you on 1 week season throughout the week. We'll see you back here on the DFS Lab on Thursday, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.